I didn't think twice. I didn't make a second call. I heard my son's voice crack on the other end of the line, and I was already reaching for my keys before he finished the sentence. It was 2:17 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been awake anyway. At 63, sleep isn't what it used to be. I was sitting in the recliner my late wife picked out 30 years ago, the one with the worn armrest on the left side, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. The television was on but muted. I wasn't really watching it. I was just keeping the silence at bay the way old men do when a house gets too quiet. My phone lit up the room. I saw his name on the screen and felt that specific kind of relief a parent feels when a grown child calls late the half second before you answer, where you think, okay, he's alive. Whatever it is, he's alive. But the moment I picked up, that relief evaporated. Pa. His voice was barely above a whisper. Strained, like he was talking through clenched teeth. Pa, I need you to come get me. I sat up straight. Son, what's wrong? Where are you? I'm at the lake house. He paused. I could hear him breathing carefully, like each breath cost him something. Her father won't let me leave. He took my keys. Pa, I don't think I'm okay. I was already standing. What do you mean you're not okay? Are you hurt? Another pause. Longer this time. I think they put something in my drink. I stopped moving for exactly 1 second. 1 second of absolute stillness. Then I grabbed my jacket off the hook by the door. I'm coming, I said. Don't hang up. Pa, listen, her father has people here. He said if I try to leave, he'll... The call dropped. I tried calling back 4 times on my way to the truck. Straight to voicemail every time. The lake house was 40 minutes away. Up the mountain, through switchbacks and pine-lined roads that I'd driven exactly once before, when my son and his wife first rented the property for a long weekend the previous summer. I remembered thinking it was beautiful country. Remote. The kind of place where voices don't carry. That thought sat in my stomach like a stone the whole drive up. Now I want to be clear about something, because it matters. I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, why didn't he call 911? And I want to explain exactly why, because it's not the same situation as it might look from the outside. 3 months earlier, my son had tried to leave his wife's family home after a dinner that turned hostile. Her father, a man named Gerald, had called the sheriff's department personally and told them my son had been drinking and was a danger on the road. The deputies showed up. They field tested him. He was stone cold sober. But Gerald shook the lead deputy's hand in the driveway like they were old friends, and my son spent 4 hours sitting in a parking lot waiting to be cleared while Gerald laughed on his front porch. Gerald had been the county commissioner for 11 years. He knew every badge in that county by first name. So no, I didn't call 911. Not because I panicked, not because my brain froze, because I knew exactly what would happen if I did, and my son didn't have 4 hours. I drove fast. Not reckless. I've had 30 years of early mornings and late nights on mountain roads, but I drove with intention. The heater in the truck pushed warm air against the windshield, fogging the edges, and I wiped it with the back of my hand twice without slowing down. The radio stayed off. I needed to think. My son had married into that family 4 years ago. His wife, I'll be honest, I had reservations from the beginning. Not about her personally, but about the weight her father put on every room he entered. Gerald was the kind of man who introduced himself by listing what he owned. He'd shake your hand and tell you about his boat before he asked your name. The first time we met, over Sunday dinner, he spent 45 minutes explaining to me why his way of doing things was simply the correct way of doing things. My son loved his wife. I could see that clearly. And she wasn't a bad person. She'd been raised in that shadow her whole life and didn't always know what to do when it shifted. I tried to be patient. I kept my opinions to myself more often than felt natural. I showed up when I was invited and stayed out of their business when I wasn't. But I never fully trusted Gerald. And when my son's voice came through that phone sounding like that, I understood in my gut that I had been right not to. I turned off the main road onto the gravel lane that led up to the lake house at 2:58 inches the morning. My headlights swept across the tree line and then across the wide front porch of the house, catching the white-painted wood and the two rocking chairs and the American flag that Gerald always made a point of flying, even at the lake. There were lights on inside. Vehicles in the drive, Gerald's black truck, his wife's sedan, and a third one I didn't recognize, a large SUV with tinted windows. I parked behind the sedan. I turned the engine off. I sat for a moment. I was 63 years old, and I had learned the hard way that walking into a situation sideways, angry, unthinking, no plan, helps no one. I had learned that the first time cost you the second chance. So I took 30 seconds, deliberately, and I thought about what I was walking into. Then I got out of the truck and walked up the porch steps and knocked on the door. Gerald answered it faster than I expected. He was still dressed slacks, a collared shirt, not a man who'd been woken up. His expression when he saw me wasn't surprised. It was amused, the way a man looks when a situation is going exactly how he intended it to go. "Well," he said, "I was wondering if he'd call you. Where is my son?" Gerald leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. He was a big man, broad across the chest, the kind of build that had been impressive at 40 and was now just thick. "Your son is resting. He had too much to drink tonight." "My son doesn't drink," I said. "Where is he?" "He had a bit more than usual. It happens. He's in the guest room, sleeping it off. Nothing to worry about." He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "You're welcome to come back in the morning and take him home then. Right now, the road up here is dark, and I wouldn't want anyone driving in a state of, 'I want to see him now.'" Gerald's smile stayed perfectly in place. "I don't think that's going to happen tonight." Behind him, down the hallway, I heard a door, footsteps. Then I heard my son's voice strained, slow, like the words were fighting through water, saying something I couldn't make out. I moved. I didn't shove Gerald. I want to be precise about that. I put my hand flat against the door and pushed it open wider, and I walked past him into the entryway, and he stepped back. Whether by choice or reflex, I don't know, but I kept moving down the hallway toward the sound of my son's voice, and Gerald was saying something loud behind me. Something about calling the sheriff, something about how I had just made a very serious mistake, and I honestly did not hear most of it. I found my son in the guest room at the end of the hall. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, still dressed, trying to stand up and not quite making it. His eyes were glassy and too slow. When he looked up and saw me, his face did something complicated, relief and shame and exhaustion all at once, and he said my name the same way he said it when he was 8 years old and had fallen off his bicycle. I was at his side in 3 steps. I put my hand on his face and looked at his eyes. His pupils were unequal. I'd seen that once before in my life, after a hunting accident with a friend, and I knew what it meant. "We're going to the hospital," I said. Gerald said it was just. I know what Gerald said. "Can you walk if I help you?" He nodded. It took him a moment, but he nodded. I got him upright, one arm around my shoulders, and we started back down the hallway. Gerald was in the doorway at the end of the hall with his arms crossed, his wife behind him with her hand over her mouth. Beside Gerald stood the man from the SUV, younger, wide, wearing an expression that was trying very hard to look like authority. "You need to put him back in that room," Gerald said. "Get out of my way," I said. "He's not going anywhere tonight. He's in no state to. He's in that state because of you." I kept walking. My son's weight was shifting, leaning harder into me, and I adjusted. "And we're going to the hospital, and they're going to document every single thing they find in his system. And then we're going to have a very different conversation than this one." Gerald took one step toward me. The man from the SUV moved with him. I stopped walking. I looked at Gerald. I want to describe this accurately. I was not afraid. I have been afraid in my life, genuinely afraid, the kind that lives in the bottom of your spine, and this was not that. What I felt in that moment was something quieter and colder than fear, something that had been building for 4 years. "Gerald," I said, very calmly, "I am 63 years old, and I am holding up my son, who you have drugged, in your hallway at 3 in the morning. I am not going to fight you, but I promise you, on everything I have, that if you put one hand on either of us, I will make sure every person in this county knows exactly what happened in this house tonight." Gerald's jaw tightened. "Furthermore," I said, My son called me at 2:17 this morning. That call is logged. The 4 calls I made back are logged. The time I arrived at this property is logged on my phone's GPS. I have been logging things for a very long time, Gerald, because I never fully trusted you. And I want you to think very carefully about what you do in the next 5 seconds. The wide man from the SUV glanced at Gerald. Gerald's arms came uncrossed slowly. His wife made a small sound behind him. I walked past them both, through the front door, down the porch steps, and to my truck. I got my son into the passenger seat, buckled his belt, and drove down the mountain. I called my daughter-in-law on the way. I called her directly, not to accuse her, but because she deserved to know what was happening, and because she needed to make a choice. She picked up on the second ring she'd been awake. I could tell from her voice, and when I told her I had her husband and I was taking him to the hospital, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "How bad is he?" "I don't know yet," I said. "But I need you to be there." She was there before we were. She was standing at the emergency entrance when I pulled in, still in her coat from the drive, and when she saw her husband's face through the window, she put her hand over her mouth the same way her mother had, but the expression behind it was entirely different. Her mother's had been guilt. Hers was grief. The emergency room took him back immediately. The attending physician, a young woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 20 hours, listened to me describe his symptoms without saying a word, then looked at his pupils and put in orders for a tox screen before I finished my second sentence. She did not make me feel like a crazy old man. She made me feel like someone who had gotten there in time. I sat in the waiting room for 3 hours. My daughter-in-law sat 2 chairs away from me for most of it. We didn't talk much at first. Then, around 5 in the morning, she said, "I didn't know he was going to do this." "I believe you," I said. "He's done things before, pushed, manipulated, but not." She stopped. "Not like this." "No," I said. "Not like this." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be on the other side of my father." "I know," I said. "That's the hardest part of what you're facing, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at me. Her eyes were red but dry. "Are you going to help me?" "You're my son's wife," I said, "which makes you my family. So yes." The tox screen came back positive for a sedative one that Gerald's wife had a prescription for. It was in his system at a level that the physician called significant. She used that word twice, and both times she looked at me directly when she said it. My son spent the night in the hospital for observation. He was discharged the following afternoon, pale and exhausted but coherent. He didn't remember much after the second drink at dinner. He remembered feeling wrong, like the room was tilting, and remembering with absolute clarity the moment he understood that Gerald wasn't going to help him. That Gerald had, in fact, caused it. He said the worst part wasn't the drug. The worst part was realizing that the man he'd been trying to impress for 4 years, the man he'd bent himself into uncomfortable shapes to please, had looked at him that night as nothing more than a problem to be managed. I didn't say anything. I just listened. That was what he needed. In the 3 weeks that followed, things moved quickly. My son filed a police report not with the county sheriff's department, but with the state police, which I had already contacted that same morning from the hospital parking lot. I'd made that call while my son was still being evaluated, right after I called my old colleague at the DA's office in the next county over. We'd worked together 20 years back, when I was still in insurance investigations, and he owed me a favor that I had never once considered calling in until that morning. He took the call. He listened. Then he said, "Send me everything." I sent him the call logs, the GPS timestamps, the photos I had taken of my son's condition when we arrived at the hospital, the doctor's report, which my son authorized me to receive, the statements my daughter-in-law gave voluntarily because she did give them, fully and without hesitation, and I want to be clear about that. Whatever her failings in the years prior, when the moment came, she stood on the right side of it. Gerald retained the best criminal defense attorney in the state within 48 hours. I'm sure he assumed that would settle things. I'm sure he went to sleep that first night genuinely believing that his name, his connections, and his money would close the door on whatever I had started. He didn't know what I knew about doors. 22 years in insurance investigations teaches you something specific about men like Gerald. They are meticulous about the things they think matter and sloppy about everything else. Gerald had been so focused on controlling the situation that he hadn't once considered that his wife's prescription records, combined with a talk screen, combined with 3 witnesses who had been present that night, would paint a picture that no attorney's hourly rate could erase. His wife's prescription, my son's blood, a room full of people at 3 a.m. who were all awake when they had no reason to be. The sedative charge came first. Then, as the state police investigation widened, other things came out, things I hadn't even known to look for. Financial pressure Gerald had been applying to my son's business for over a year. Emails, recovered by a forensic accountant my colleague recommended, in which Gerald had discussed with the wide man from the SUV how to handle my son if he continued to resist the restructuring Gerald wanted. The lake house weekend hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned. That was the thing that took my breath away. When I finally sat alone with that information, not the anger. The anger I had managed. It was the calculation of it. The cold planning that went into sedating my son in a lake house, 40 minutes from anywhere, surrounded by Gerald's people, with no way out. My son could have died. A different dosage, a different reaction, a slightly longer delay before his call connected. He could have died up there and Gerald would have called it a tragedy, and the county sheriff would have shaken his hand in the driveway. Gerald was charged on 3 counts. His wife cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge on the prescription misuse. The wide man from the SUV, whose name, it turned out, was someone Gerald had hired specifically to keep situations from escalating, which is an interesting word choice for a man who escalated everything, pleaded out before the trial date was set. Gerald himself did not plead. Gerald believed, until very nearly the end, that his version of events would prevail, that the father-in-law narrative, the concerned family patriarch, would hold up under scrutiny, that my son would be painted as troubled, unstable, prone to overreaction. It did not hold up. It turned out that when you have call logs and GPS records and a physician's report and a cooperative witness and 22 years of an investigator's habits informing every step you take, it turns out that none of that holds up. I was in the courtroom on the day the verdict came in. I had been there for most of the trial. I sat in the gallery, 3 rows back, and I watched Gerald's face as the jury returned. He kept his expression controlled for most of the reading. Then his attorney touched his arm and he looked down at the table, and in that moment, the control slipped. Not much. Just enough. I didn't feel satisfaction the way I might have expected to. What I felt was something closer to release, the long, slow exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for 4 years without fully realizing it. My son was sitting beside his wife in the gallery. She had her hand in his. She had separated from her father 7 months before the trial, moved back into their home, started the work of rebuilding. It was slow. It was not easy. There were days when she looked at my son, and I could see the guilt in her face, the reckoning with her own part in years of accommodation. And there were days when my son looked at her, and I could see him deciding, again and again, that he loved her enough to stay in it. I respected both of them for that. Loving someone doesn't erase what their family did, but ending a marriage doesn't erase what you built either. They were trying to hold both truths at once, and that is an honest and difficult thing to do. After the verdict, my son and I walked to the parking lot together. It was a cold afternoon, the sky gray and flat, the kind of sky that promises snow. He had his hands in his pockets and he was quiet for a while, the way he gets when he's sorting through something large. Finally he said, "How did you know, Pa, when you drove up there? How did you know it was real and not just, I could have been overreacting. How did you know to go?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about sitting in my recliner at 2 a.m. with cold coffee and a muted television. I thought about seeing his name on the screen and the half-second of relief before I answered. Because it was 2:17 inches the morning, I said, and you called me. You have never once called me that late without a real reason. In 34 years, not once. He nodded slowly. A father pays attention, I said, even when his kids are grown, especially then. Because when you're grown and you call me at 2 a.m., I know you've already tried everything else. He stopped walking. He turned to look at me, This 34-year-old man who still had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubbornness, and he said, "Thank you for coming." "There was never a world where I didn't," I said. We stood there in the gray afternoon for a moment, and then he put his arms around me the way he used to when he was small, not the brief, backlapping hug of adult men, but the real kind, the kind that means something, and I held on. I am 63 years old. I have buried a wife. I have built things and lost things and learned the difference between what matters and what only seems like it does. I have spent long nights in a recliner in a quiet house, learning to carry what I carry without being crushed by it. And I know this. When your child calls you from a dark place at 2 in the morning, you don't calculate. You don't weigh options. You grab your keys and you go. And you figure out the rest on the road. Because the road always reveals what you need to know. Gerald got 18 months. He will likely serve less. Men like Gerald often do. But my son came home. He sat across from me at my kitchen table the following Sunday, coffee in hand, talking too loud the way he always does about something he read that week. His wife laughed at something he said. The coffee was hot. The house was not quiet. That is what I drove 40 minutes up a mountain at 2 a.m. to protect. Not justice, though I am glad justice came. Not a verdict, though I am glad the verdict was right. Just that. My son, at my table, loud and alive and home. And I would do it again, without hesitation, without a second call, every single time.